So I guess in everyone in the audience, as it is an energy economics conference, is aware of the problem also of climate change and the need to have mitigation measures to cut emissions. So my starting point for this presentation today is not the general introduction into climate change and climate policy, but I want to start directly with the relevance of incidence analysis in climate policy. And here the general fact, or what we see in many countries on the globe, is that when we look into the expenditures on energy and fossil fuels and on a country level, we see that households in lower income groups spend more of their expenditures on these energy sources, and especially on fossil fuels. And therefore, if we assume a policy like a carbon or a fuel tax, the first intuition would be that these low-income households would be burdened stronger by this policy than high-income households, as they spend more of their share for these emission or energy-intensive commodities. But when we want to consider the incidence of a policy, we can think of two more channels through which this overall effect on households is determined. And this is not only the direct channel of the income use, as it is called, so on the spending of fuels and energy, but also an indirect effect on the income use side. So how a policy changes prices for other commodities than energy, and an income source effect. So how in a new general equilibrium, factor incomes, so labor and capital incomes are affected from a policy. That all three channels ultimately determine the incidence of a policy. And correspondingly to this different channels, also different approaches are used in the literature to determine or to look into incidence of climate policies. And one is a household budget survey, where we get effects exactly as we saw before on the previous slide. But also input-output analysis can account, for example, for carbon footprints or macroeconomic modeling, like CGE modeling. And to give you just a very brief overview of some relevant literature in this context, I listed here some of the sources which were either rather recent or relevant in the past. And we have these three approaches that I named before here. And what they do is mostly that they look into climate policies like carbon pricing, carbon taxing, or fuel taxes. And most of the studies focus also a great part of literature on Western economies. And they find mostly a regressive effect, so burdening low-income households stronger than high-income households, or proportional to U-shaped effects in terms of distributional outcomes. And all of these three approaches, or the studies in these approaches, acknowledge the three incidence channels I named before, although they cover only part of them in part of the studies. What is important here to mention is that this incidence effect that is estimated in these studies is without considering redistributive revenue recycling. So if you put a tax on carbon, then you also generate revenues, and you can use these revenues to compensate for regressive outcomes. And this is also acknowledged in the literature and found that this compensation may outweigh this regressive effect. But what was also found recently in the literature, that the effectiveness of this recycling may be limited because of within group variation, so to speak, about horizontal equity. And therefore, in the research I'm presenting here, I want to look in different aspects, in three different aspects. One is the aspect of these different approaches. So what is and to use these different approaches in one context and with one framework assumption. So apply these three approaches for the case of Austria, and want to look what are the different estimates. So what could be the, so to speak, an error of using these different approaches and maybe neglecting one or other channels of incidence. The other aspect is I want to show you how horizontal equity, how relevant this is when considering not only direct expenditures on fuels, but also emissions embodied in the other consumption goods. And the third aspect is that I want to look not only into this carbon or fuel tax instruments, but also into other instruments and how how their incidence looks like. So I will briefly show you the three approaches, not going too much into detail. But as I said, I wanted to have the same framework assumptions with all three approaches to make them kind of comparable. And what I used is that is a household budget survey for Austria, the still most recent one for 2014 and 15, which has a sample of about 7,000 households. And I cluster them into income deciles and use a lifetime income, so an expenditure proxy, which is also was argued to account better for lifetime income because of short-term income changes are somehow smoothened in the expenditure when we look at expenditure instead of income. And I use a household equivalent measure because then we can get a per capita effects out of it. And when we look at these household expenditure shares for Austria, we get a picture that is quite consistent with the literature. So we have here low-income households spending more of their expenditures on heating fuels, and also, except for the very lowest income households, more of the transport fuels. And this is also quite common that in economies where public transport is not so bad, very low income households mostly do not have a car and therefore spend not so much on transport fuels. And what we see also that the within group variation is higher for low income households than for high income households. So although we have an average of only below 3% of spending on transport fuels, some of the households spend up to nearly 20% or up to 25% in the second lowest income group, whereas in high income groups, the spending on transport fuels is only up to below 20%. And therefore, the effectiveness of redistributing might be questioned. The second approach I want to show you is this input-output approach, here for calculating the embodied emissions in the consumption. So we use a kind of standard environmentally extended multi-regional input-output approach, where we calculate the consumption-based emissions or carbon footprint by using the Leontief inverse and production-based emissions. And we also use a diagonalized vector of region-specific sectoral emission intensities, so this term instead of this upper term here, to get into the closer look into the specific regional and sectoral sources of the Austrian emissions. And because we are only interested in the emissions along the supply chain that also are emitted within Austria, because we look at national instruments, policy instruments, and therefore we're also only interested in these emissions that occur in Austria in the commodities that are consumed in Austria. And we use again the same clustering and as with the household budget survey for Austria, where we get our consumption data from and then link that to the carbon footprints on a sectoral level. And when we look here at the share of emissions now, we see the same pattern of emissions as we saw before with the household budget survey. But what we also see is that the share of emissions coming from this energy and transport fuels is quite low and sums up only to about 20 to 30%. And the rest of the emissions come from emissions embodied in our consumption. So up here. And that these emissions that are embodied in our consumption are more equally distributed. And especially when we look into the variation of emissions within income deciles, we saw that that this variation is rather high for transport fuels and decreasing, and the variation for heating fuels is even lower. But when we consider all the emissions embodied in our consumption and the direct emissions from fuels, the variation is much lower, and therefore this horizontal equity concerns might be less relevant when we consider also carbon tax or fuel tax. And the third approach that I want to show you is general equilibrium modeling, where we use the same database as for the input-output calculations, but now we account for responses on the consumption side of households and on the production side from firms. And therefore we can include also these kind of long-term effects when firms adopt their production structures, and therefore change also the income situation for labor and capital income changes. And we disaggregate the representative households that we usually have in this database to account for these income groups, and use yield data to implement these income source side, where we have capital, high and low skilled labor, and transfer payments on different households for the different household groups. We also implement a subsistence consumption using a Stone-Geary utility function. And I would just briefly want to show you the nesting tree that we have for this constant elasticity of substitution functions, how we model it in the CG model. And here I have the income side, where we have these different types of labor, capital, and the subsistence consumption. And what is not displayed here, we have also this transfer income. And then we have this consumption and saving, which is fixed for each income group. So the amounts differ within the income groups, but the structure of these are the same. And then we have this nesting into COICAP 1 level and COICAP 2 level, where we have a substitution elasticity of 1 on the COICAP 1 level. And as in the literature, there are mainly carbon taxes or fuel taxes are investigated. The idea here for this study was also to look into one of these policies as a fuel tax, but also look into two case study policies of a building code adaptation that would allow the use of more wood-based building structures in Austria. And we assume externally that this technology will be adopted by this adaptation in the building code. And the third policy of company mobility plans, where large companies are assumed to be obliged to implement environmentally friendly commuting plans for the employees. And we use for the second and third policy, we use case study data for Austria, and they show a very similar emission effect. And we slightly adapt them to have very comparable policies on the environmental effectiveness level. And then we also scale the fuel tax policy to have a same emission reduction across all of the three policies. And when we now compare for the first policy of a fuel tax, the estimated incidence, so the change in policy burden across household groups, then we find for the household budget survey that the estimated incidence effect, so for all of the three approaches, is the estimated effect is regressive. But for the household budget survey, the effect is a bit more regressive, as we have here this dotted line. The input-output estimate that accounts not only for the direct fuel use, but also for the embodied emissions, shows a bit less regressive effect. And the CGE effect, the CGE estimate, is a bit lower than the input-output estimate, but having a rather similar shape. And the reason for this is that when we disaggregate in the CGE model the different channels, then we see that the price effect here in this dotted line with the squares, so the change in consumer prices makes up the largest effect of the shape, and the recycling of the policy is assumed to be equally across income groups. So there is some general equilibrium effects that do not fully get it to a straight line, but it's mainly equally redistributed, the revenues from the tax, and therefore the overall incidence effect is just shifted upwards from this consumer price effect, because the other channels of skilled, unskilled labor and capital income play only a very minor role. And yeah, so let's come to the second policy, which is which was the building code adaptation. And here the picture looks quite differently. So with the household budget survey, we can kind of only estimate the additional burden across households that comes from real or imputed rents, and the change of prices for the construction, or induced by the change of construction prices because of this new technology being adopted. And here the estimated effect from the household budget is quite straight and slightly negative. If we count also in the input-output approach for the use of construction activities within the final demand, then we get a bit more negative effect, but also quite proportional. But when we consider in the CGE model also the income sources, so the income of labor and capital, then we see that we get a very progressive effect. And the decomposition of these channels we see again here, where we have these low-income households generating more of their income from labor income than from capital income, and the technology that is then adopted to a larger extent is more based on labor, and therefore these incomes from labor are benefiting the low-income households stronger than the capital effect that is actually negative and burdening therefore high-income households stronger. And the consumer price change contributes only very minorly to the overall effect in the CGE model. The third policy here the heading is wrong. So that's the mobility plans that we assume to be implemented on the company level. And here we have again a rather straight or a rather proportional estimate from the household budget survey, as this accounts for the direct burden of public transport subsidies that are assumed to be in place on the company level. And from the input-output approach, we find also again a bit more negative effect, as we have here the burden of the induced total investment cost of the firm as well. And with the CGE estimate, we also have again this income source effect from the capital and labor incomes. And these are actually also found to contribute quite a lot, that as these large firms appear to be more capital intensive than smaller firms, and therefore they are they carrying more of the investment costs, and giving this stronger through the capital channel to the households, and therefore burdening high-income households stronger. And the consumer price is also kind of this inverted U-shape because of this interaction effect on from public transport subsidies and price effects on a firm level that determine the consumer prices and its other sectors. So to sum up, for the three policies, we saw that the fuel tax policy is estimated to be regressive with all three approaches, but the household budget survey estimates a bit more regressive effect. And the input-output and CG estimates are quite similar because of these factor incomes hardly play a role, as we saw in the CGE model. For the second policy, we saw that the dominating source was this income source effect, where we saw labor and capital incomes changing quite strongly, and prices do not really change, and therefore these income source effects are dominating the progressive outcome of this policy. And for company mobility plans, we saw that there was, as for the building code policy, that the estimates of the household budget survey and the input-output approach are quite proportional, but only with the CG model we find kind of this interaction effect, and which are especially strong for these company mobility plans. And so overall, we see that the incidence strongly varies across policy instruments, which confirms that such analysis on a very policy level is quite relevant. What is kind of a discussion is that the applicability of household budget survey is rather limited, because it does exactly not account for the three channels, but only for one of these three incidence channels. We saw from the input-output estimate that it can account for these embodied emissions, and therefore can be useful as short-term interpretation of incidence for policies that where income source effects are negligible. And we saw also for the input-output estimate that the horizontal equity effect is might be less of an issue when we consider economy-wide taxes. And in general, we showed that the incidence of a policy is determined by four aspects, which are the consumption patterns of households and the corresponding emission intensity of this consumption, the existing distribution and composition of the income, and the specific policy and policy design that we consider. And the suggestion here is that we should inform policymakers and the public based on estimates that are able to cover all of these aspects, which would be the suggestion. So thanks for your attention, and I'm very curious for your comments.
Thank you, Stefan, for this presentation. So we have time for discussion or questions. So thanks to those who joined us during the presentation and who are participating now to this session. So please, if you have any question, you can raise your hand. So using the tool at the bottom of your screen, if you click on reaction, I think you can raise your hand. So if there is any question or remark, please go on. Yes, Laura.
Yes, I've got a question. In France, some households, authors as Douane and Schubert demonstrated that the regressivity is linked to the location and to the carbon content of the equipment inside the household. And I don't know in what extent it's the same in Austria, but have you considered policy where we do not necessarily only recycle in relation to the income of households, but also policies where we target low-income households with high carbon content equipment and households who depend on their thermal vehicle to go to their work, for instance. But I don't know in what extent it's difficult to collect this data in the case of Austria. That was my question.
Yeah, thank you. Very, very important aspect. So in the study, I did not look into different recycling schemes. So I used only this proportional to income recycling to isolate this other effects. Exactly because of this reason, that redistribution might be very difficult, and that for different countries, different aspects are relevant for the burdening and for the redistributing then, because this one aspect that I showed with the horizontal equity was that that the recycling might be easier when we consider carbon footprints. So also the emission intensive equipment would be covered there, but still this can be an issue. And therefore an argument would be that we need to use policies that might be regressive, but combine them also with progressive policies that are either that not only redistributing but also climate friendly, and options would be also to have public investment in infrastructure that is accessible for all income groups that are and the infrastructure is climate friendly, so public transport or good isolated community housing or such aspects.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other question or remark? Okay, I have a few questions and remarks, but didn't want to prevent people to ask them their own questions and remarks. Well, first of all, I would like to tell you that that's a great job to look at other tools also than pricing tools, you know, because when we talk about climate policy, of course, we also have in mind norms and other kind of regulations. But it's not always the case that economists go into this kind of thing and try to make an assessment of these tools as well. So I would like to say first that this is great. And my first question is, how far did you go in the combination of these different tools? You know, if you want to use fuel tax plus change in regulation, have you measured the precise effect of the combination of different things? And have you gone even further looking at other kind of non-pricing tools in that matter? And so this is my first question. My second one is more general, and I would like to. There is some notion in the background of all your presentation, and basically of all the issues that are at stake when we look at this kind of thing. Is the notion of fuel poverty, you know, for those deciles, the first deciles actually of the series, and the problem of having problems to heat and to get access to energy because of poverty. And how does your work articulate with fuel poverty, especially in Austria, in the different work that do you see links with work on fuel poverty in Austria? Have you occasions to work with people working on this particular topic as well? That could be also interesting as a point of discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Antoine. Two very important points. Yeah, the connection to fuel poverty, there would be, I guess, quite some links, to especially focus on these households that are in the area of fuel poverty. I did not look into that in more detail, but it would be a kind of natural connection, I would say, to isolate these households and look into the policy effects as a specific group. So I think this could be a further step that could be taken with quite doable amount of effort.
Especially, sorry, just stress something on this point, especially if you want to test a non-pricing regulation, such as changing your heating system, you know, or stopping to have a fuel heating system at home. You need to go to electricity things or to go to natural gas things and stop using oil heating system, for instance. That would make probably a direct link, you know, between your non-pricing regulation test and the question of fuel poverty, basically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good point. And for the first question, thanks for the for this first comment. We looked also into, so we had a bit of a bigger sample of case studies that we looked at in the simulations, but those two additional ones to the fuel tax actually show the most interesting results and these different aspects of interaction on the different income incidence channels. And we had a few more because but it's always hard to collect case study data. So we were in contact with different organizations within Austria that do this. For example, these mobility programs are in place on a voluntary basis currently, and there is some data available that we could use, that we were able to use, and then we assumed them to be compulsory, and but it's always hard to collect this data for various policies. But we had some more, but they were those presented were the most interesting ones. And in combining these policies, I didn't get into the step already, but would be also very interesting to show how kind of a package could look like that is interacting on this progressive and regressive policy effects.
Okay, thanks. We have time for one more question or remark, if there is any. And if you don't find the button, raise your hand. You can also use the chat just to say, I would like to ask a question. So please. No, that's it. Okay, so thanks a lot, Stefan, for your presentation.
Thanks as well.
And so we move to the second presentation by Tarek. So please, maybe Stefan, you can stop sharing the screen. So yeah, thank you. So Tarek, if you have something to share, please.
Yeah,
okay,
thank
great.
you. Yeah,
thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Antoine. Yeah. This is the outline for my presentation. I will start to describe the basic structure of social accounting metrics in summary. As maybe you know that social accounting matrix is a square matrix that each row and column represents a certain element of the economy. Such as productive sector, governments, households, and enterprises, investments, and rest of the world. It shows the transfer between an agent to other agents, between an agent from column to an agent in row. There are different features of social accounting metrics or SAM. There are first, it's an economic system that shows the interaction between economic activities, goods, services, and different institutions. It shows the relationship between each other and the rest of the world. Second, it's an appropriate model for analyzing economic and social policies. Third, building SAM aggregates information from different sources, which provides a database for the economic structure. Can we take here an example? Here in households row, it shows that household income represents payments from renting factors of production, enterprises, households, and from government, which is respectively in the factors of production column, enterprises column, government column, and rest of the world column. Social accounting metrics for Egypt in 1979. The first SAM has been developed, and then there are a series of matrices have been developed by different researchers. Recently, both EFEBRI and CABMAS, which is a central agency for public mobilization statistics in Egypt, developed different social accounting matrices. The latest one was for financial year 2014-15, which was the first regional SAM they built for Egypt. We can see here, this is the macro SAM, because as you may know, to build SAM requires two processes. The first one is to build a macro SAM, which is aggregate SAM, and second is to build a disaggregate SAM, which is micro. Here the macro SAM they build, it includes 11 accounts beside total, which is activities, production, transaction cost, and factor of productions to rest of the world, and then total. The base SAM includes about 71 commodities and 68 activities. The idea of disaggregation depends on the research question. So if you focus on how to distribute the income, you may disaggregate the households into rural and urban, and education to skilled and post-skilled and semi-skilled. Then I disaggregated the electricity sector by the base SAM includes only one sector. It was electricity sector was aggregated into one sector. I disaggregated the electricity sector into 4 different subsectors, which is based on the sources of electricity generation, which is oil, natural gas, hydropower, wind, and solar. The main challenge we faced here is there is no specific classification for renewable energy in supply and use tables, which is usually the main source for SAM. So to solve this problem, we calculated, or we used, the shares of electricity generation. So in this figure, we can see that Egypt depends mainly on fossil fuels, as oil as natural gas for 69%, oil for 21%, and hydropower for 9%, while both wind and solar only for about 1%. Also, to estimate the intermediate demand for electricity generation, we used input shares for natural gas, petroleum products, and other chemicals. The disaggregation of factors of production. In the national SAM, there are 3 factors of production, which is labor, land, and capital. We disaggregated labor into 3 types on the basis of skill levels, which is unskilled, semi-skilled, and skilled. While capital and land, they remain the same. In household sector, Also in the base SAM, there was only one account, one sector. We divided the household sector into urban and rural, each of them segregated into 10 households representative groups based on per capita expenditure quantile. Each quantile represents fifths of the population. This data we collected from household surveys. Our disaggregated SAM consists of 42 commodities and 41 activities. As we aggregated some accounts and disaggregated, as I said, household sector and electricity sector and factors of production. So our SAM consists of 9 energy commodities and 9 energy activities and 10 energy commodities. Of course, SAM is used can be is for data for the for CGE model. We can say that without SAM, if you don't have SAM, we can't build CGE model. But in addition to that, SAM can be used to describe the economic structure. It can be used to describe the economic structure as it provides the database, for example, for Egypt's economic structure. So by using our disaggregated SAM, we calculated different economic indicators such as value-added shares, household income and expenditures, trade shares, and governance. First, here in this table, we can see that the value added in the labor, the share of labor in value added, it varied between 1.8% in oil to about 65% in service activities, while the share of capital in value added varied between 35% to 98% in oil. So these figures show that oil extraction sector here is capital intensive sector, as the share of capital to factors of production is about 98%, while labor is only about 2%. Also, it shows that here in service activities, the share of labor is relatively high, about 65%, because service activities include activities such as health, government, and education activities, which based on labor for providing services. Here, this figure, we show the sectoral share of total GDP in Egypt. As you may see that service activities, here, service activities, it accounted more than half of GDP, while electricity, it's accounted about 1% of GDP, while the water is accounted less than 1%, which is the lowest share of GDP in Egypt. The trade shares here, the table shows the trade shares in Egypt. We show that agriculture sector is accounted about 5% of total exports in Egypt, while the manufacturing exports, it's the highest percentage of exports, while manufacturing imports of total imports of Egypt reached about 52%, which is the largest import commodity, while the import intensity of manufacturing is low. It accounted only about 20%. Our findings show that the export share of electricity was significantly low. It's only about, it's less than 1%, while the electricity wasn't imported. Also here, we calculated the import intensity from our disaggregated SAM, which shows that 25 or 26% of total demand of transportation sector was supplied from abroad, while 20% of total manufactured goods was demand is imported. Also, we see here that the import intensity is very low in both in crude oil, construction, and other service activities, which is accounting for about 4% and 5% of total demand respectively. Here we also calculated the export intensity, which shows that the share of exported accommodation and food services is very high. It's about 58%. Also, we saw that the mining sector is the highest export intensity with about 107%. The households, this figure shows the household share of final consumption expenditure by quantile. It shows that the spending or the expenditures differed or varied according to the households group representatives. We can see here that the highest spending quantile is this one, which is the fifth quantile in urban areas, which is the highest income in urban areas, as they spent about 35% of total household expenditure. At the same time, we can see that the fifth quantile in rural areas, which is the highest income in rural areas, they spent about 10%. So we can see that the highest income in both urban and rural spent about 45% of total households expenditure in Egypt. Also, overall, we can say that the urban households spent about 61% of total households expenditure in Egypt. The government here, we can see in this figure that total taxes accounted about 76% of total government revenue, as the direct taxes on enterprises and households contributed by 40%, direct taxes on factor income at rate of 1%, and indirect taxes on imports, it accounted about 6.3%. So all of these figures show that Egypt or the government depends on taxes to finance its expenditure. And also here we can see that transfers from the enterprise sector to the government, it's amounted about 57%. 57% of total government revenue, while the transfers from the household sector to the government amounted about 3%. The contribution of the rest of the world to the government, it was about 7%. So here we can see this figure is that taxes paid by households based on their quantiles. Also here we can see that the highest income quantile in urban areas, which is the fifth quantile, pays about 38%, while the percentage of lowest income quantile in urban is paid about 1.3%, while the highest income in rural areas, they spent about 9%, while the taxes paid for the lowest groups, they pay about 3% of total taxes. Yeah, thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Tarek, for your presentation. So perfectly on time. And so we have a lot of time for discussion or questions, if you have any. So please raise your hand or just ask to take the floor through the chat. Okay, I can start.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, Stefan, you wanted to ask something?
Okay, yeah. I wanted to first, thanks very lot for the presentation. Interesting to see the structure of the Egypt economy. What my question would be, what are your next steps planned? Do you want to set up a CGE model, and what
framework you want to look into?
Yeah. Thank you for this comment. Yes, of course. This aggregated SAM I will use in my CGE model, because my studies focus on renewable energy. My aim is to estimate the economic impacts of renewable energy in Egypt. So, of course, the core data for CGE model is to build SAM, or disaggregated SAM. So I said, before I build my CGE model, I need disaggregated SAM which focus on renewable energy. As the current SAM, they are not focused on renewable energy. And my aim is to estimate the economic impacts of renewable energy policies in Egypt. So I calibrated the model with disaggregated SAM.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so yeah, I had the same kind of question as Stefan to know more about the next steps, and so you just answered, and also about the the different application in energy or climate policy. But I see that it's part of your whole project on renewable energy, because it was sometimes hard in the presentation to see exactly what was your goal, and it's clear when you say it like this. So thanks for this. I had a question on one of your table about the composition of value added with your three factors of production, because we see finally that there is just one sector in which land play a specific role in this distribution of added value, agriculture. Could you just elaborate a little more on this, in the sense that I was quite surprised to see this, because I suspected that land could play also a role in other sectors, even a very small role, just 1% or something like that. It was quite surprising to see that just in agriculture you had this, not in mining, for instance, when you see all these open shafts in some country that play a role in terms of land, or even in other kind of activities where the location play an important role, and so you pay an extra thing to have a specific location. So could you tell us a little more on this distribution, please?
Yeah, of course. Yes, thank you. This data is based on SAM. So SAM, it's different accounts. I collected from, for example, here CABMES, which is the authority that's responsibility for this data in Egypt. They focus only on the agriculture sectors for SAM, and they chose that the land is only used for the agriculture sectors, while capital and labor is used for other sectors, but land is only used for agriculture sector. This is the data for SAM. It's not make sense, I know this, but in the national SAM or in the base SAM, it was only used by the agriculture sectors. As they divided the factors of production into three: land, labor, capital, and they divided the land, and land for only can be used only for the agriculture sector. So the issue that this is the data which is available, because in country like Egypt, it's difficult to find accurate and timely data. So here, this is the data that we can collect it.
Yeah, I see. I understand this problem, but to go further, how do you think you will manage with this for your specific project on renewable energies? Because sometimes for renewable energies like biomass, this is part of agriculture in a sense, but also for other kinds of renewables, you can need space and land. And so how do you foresee this in terms of, you miss data on this, but how you will connect the role of land as a factor of production for your electricity generation project?
Yeah, I think we will assume that land only can be used by the agriculture sectors, and we will focus on energy, we can divide the factors of production. Also, we can add energy as factor of capital, which can be used in a model in nesting the production structure, because we can divide the production structure for any model, for CGE model. We can add energy and focus on capital and labor, and we can assume that land can only be used by the agriculture sector.
Okay, Stefan, you had another question or no? Okay, just one more point maybe, but please, if anybody else has a question, can raise your hand, of course. It was about do you have any idea about the specificity of Egypt in this kind of structure? I mean, the structure of the economy with all the work you have done for disaggregating all of this. Do you have any element of comparison with similar countries and striking point that you catch your attention about maybe some specificities about Egypt?
Yeah, about disaggregation electricity sector?
Yes, in particular, or something more general if you have something in mind.
Yeah, of course, in the literature, for example, there are different studies that disaggregated the electricity sector. In China, in Germany, in Turkey, there are different studies which disaggregated the electricity sector. But to my knowledge, the first study that disaggregated the electricity sector was this study, because most of the studies in Egypt, they focus on disaggregation of agriculture sector. So this is their aim in 1997 till now. So yeah, but in the literature, they disaggregate the electricity sector to focus on the renewable energy policies to make the simulations more easier and accurate.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, Stefan?
Yeah, thanks. I would also have a follow-up question in terms of comparison points. Did you consider to compare to other databases like this international databases, although they might have their troubles as well, or definitely do have like GTAB or XIOBase to have a comparison point for your data?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, but it's difficult for GTAB because you know that to use GTAB, you need to be your policies related with other countries, which is difficult in Egypt here because the share of electricity generation is very low in Egypt. It's almost about 1% for wind and solar. So to collect the data for GTAB, it's not possible. It's not accurate. It's not. I didn't find for GTAB. But of course, I follow the literature, for example, in the disaggregation electricity sector, like the literature.
Okay. One more question or remark? No? Okay, so thanks a lot, Tarek, for your presentation.
Thank you very much.
And then we can move to Laura's presentation. I forgot to say that Laura is from EDF and in partnership with the Paris-Dauphine University. So thank you, Laura, for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you.
You can share your screen, I think.
Screen. Thank you. Two seconds. Partager l'écran.
Okay.
Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to present you this paper, which is entitled Intergenerational Effects of Financing Private Investments for Low Carbon Energy Transitions with an Application to France. I will therefore start my presentation. Before starting the motivation and literature part, I would like to define the title and the aim of this paper. So depending on the investment financing scenarios, we will observe different macroeconomic effects. So different macroeconomic effects on volume variables and on prices. And to the extent that these investments extend over 30 years, there will be significant intergenerational effects, which means that these policies will impact each agent differently according to the age and the year concerned. Indeed, these macroeconomic and intergenerational effects depend on three main factors: investment amounts, financing methods, are we going to finance these investments by debt or by tax? And these effects also depend on the evolution of price signals, such as the carbon tax and energy prices. In the academic literature, we cannot find a study of both macroeconomic and intergenerational redistributive effects of different paths of low carbon investments in the power sector, while including the evolution of the carbon tax by 2050. In other words, when we want to study the effects of low carbon investment trajectories, there's a lack in literature, even if this literature gives us some information. A first part of the literature deals with the need for significant investment to decarbonize the economy. This is my first point. But these papers do not give a precise order of magnitude on the amounts of investments, and they often struggle to give intergenerational redistributive effects. A second part of the literature deals with the effects of carbon taxes and energy prices. But these papers do not take into account the intergenerational redistributive effects of different paths of investments in the power sector. So my contribution is the following one. I developed a detailed overlapping generation general equilibrium empirical setting with three scenarios of low carbon investments in the power sector that differ on only one element, the financing method. So my key question is the following one. What are the macroeconomic and intergenerational effects of financing private investments for low carbon energy transitions in the power sector? Using an empirical general equilibrium model with 15 overlapping generations, starting with the generation 15-24 years old, ending with the generation 85 years old and over, and including 5 economic sectors with different technical progress on French data, we find two main results. First, the intergenerational redistributive effects are different because they depend on the financing method. And we will discover that in the two first financing scenarios, so when we finance these investments by debt or by firms, the middle-aged and older generations are more sensitive to the intergenerational redistributive effects, while in the third scenario, where both firms and households finance these investments, the young and future cohorts are more sensitive to the intergenerational redistributive effects. Regarding macroeconomic effects, this is my second point, the economy suffers from a drop in production in the three scenarios, mainly due to three main reasons. So first, there's a rise in energy prices for households and businesses. Why? Because of the increase in the wholesale prices. And this increase in the wholesale prices is associated with, is explained by the investment chronicle. This is the first reason. Second reason, the crowding effect of energy transition investments. And third reason explaining this drop in production is the increase in the tax to finance the policy that is paid by private agents. But I will explain the reasons with more details in the results parts. But from now, I can say that the drop in production is relatively more limited in case public debt finances the investments in the power sector. Regarding the model, on the supply side, we modeled classic nested CES constant elasticity substitution production functions for the 5 branches of the economy, which are agriculture, energy, manufacturing, construction, and services, with the demand for added value, capital, labor, energy that are determined by the first order conditions. So here you can see that production depends on value added Z and intermediate consumption IC. And value added Z is also a CES function as IC, intermediate consumption, where value added depends on capital and labor, and in the intermediate consumption depends on energy and other intermediate consumptions. We have 5 functions for the investments that are determined by the classic capital accumulation functions, depending on capital, depreciation rates, the growth rate of technical progress, the population growth rate, and current investments. So these are very classic functions. Regarding on the demand side, we modeled 15 cohorts of households that are born at different years, leading to different consumption and saving behaviors. We have a representative consumer by generation. We maximize the sum of utilities under the wealth constraints, and inside the utility function, we include the discount rate and the intergenerational elasticity of substitution. As you can see, net wealth depends on past net wealth, interest rates, labor income, transfers, less consumption, and taxes. Some households are Keynesians. This is important. So they consume all their income and they do not save. In national accounts, that means that they consume all their net disposable income. We have 2 versions of the models. One with endogenous labor, the other one with exogenous labor. For this paper, I use the model with the version with exogenous labor. Regarding public finances, the government faces a public debt that accumulates with the annual primary deficit, such as you can see, future bonds depend on current bonds, more interest payment, more primary deficits. And I'm in an open economy. Regarding the data, the model performs a sectoral breakdown, allowing to see in detail the impact on production, added value, energy, capital, investment for each sector. The calibration is made with a generational breakdown, modeling the redistributive effects for the 15 generations. The data used are the following ones. First, we used national accounts data, and my base year is 2017. I used a more detailed database given by INSEE, by national accounts, which is called Statistics on Resources and Living Conditions. Regarding energy tax data, I used Eurostat data. And in the Paris sector, investing modeling is exogenous. We used IAE's market data. And the following table represents the trajectory of low carbon investments in the Paris sector. So we have a baseline scenario, and around this baseline scenario, we made 3 variant scenarios. So in all scenarios, we have the same rise in low carbon electricity investments. But the difference between these 2 scenarios is the way these investments are financed. So in the first scenario, the rise in low carbon electricity investments is financed by public debt, but the associated rise in public debt is reimbursed in the medium run by taxes on labor income paid by both households and firms. In my second scenario, these investments are financed to a signal price or a tax on electricity consumption for firms only. And this scenario is based on an IMF paper. In my third scenario, these investments are financed by both firms and households. Here is a figure representing the level of detail we can obtain in the results. So this is the consumption expenditure by generation, by age group, as you can see. And you can observe the amount for the base year 2017. It's just to show you the type that we obtained the same type of results in all scenarios over the entire period. The results. The macroeconomic effects are the following ones. First, there is an increase in the retail prices because of the increase in the wholesale prices linked to the investment trajectory. So there is a rise in the investments. So there is a rise in wholesale prices, leading to a rise in retail prices. But this increase in retail prices is also linked to the carbon price signal applied in scenario 2 and scenario 3. And this increase in retail prices overall rate on the activity and on private agents' consumption. This is the first reason explaining this drop in production. Second reason, other energy investments, so energy investments that are not low carbon ones, are endogenous and tend to decrease in line with the crowding out effect. So there's a substitution effect. Third point, the aggregate impact is less detrimental in scenario 1, where we finance by public debt, mainly due to two main reasons. First, financial burden on private agents is postponed through public debt, while in other scenarios, the financing is immediately implemented. In other words, the increase in direct income taxes is implemented later than the increase in taxes in scenario 2 and scenario 3. Second reason explaining why there is a less detrimental impact in scenario 1 is because some households are Keynesians, and so they cannot smooth out the effect of the shock over the period because they are Keynesians, they are not Ricardians. Final point regarding these macroeconomic effects, the aggregate impact is slightly more detrimental in scenario 3, in which both households and firms contribute to financing the investment in low carbon energy transition. It's important to note, and I guess it's an important result of my model, that the burden of low carbon investments is not equally distributed between cohorts. In other words, the overall decrease in consumption hides disparities from one generation to the next. So the intergenerational redistributive effects are the following one. In scenario 1, where we finance by debt, and in scenario 2, where firms only are financing these investments, the negative effect of the investment shock on wages and capital stock penalizes relatively more middle and older generations. Why? Because middle and older generations have the highest levels of capital and labor income. In scenario 3, where both households and firms finance these investments, there is a rise in consumer prices. This is a relative price to the service sector. So there is a rise in consumer prices, which is much higher than in scenario 1 and 2. And this negative effect of rising consumer prices is greater than the negative effect on capital and wages that we can see in scenario 1 and 2. In other words, the price effect dominates. And which generations are more penalized by the price effects? Young cohorts. Thus, the shock weighs relatively more on young cohorts than on middle and older age cohorts. To conclude, 4 points to remind. First, the aggregate detrimental effects on growth, as well as the intergenerational redistributive effects, are more contained, are lower, when low carbon investments are financed by public debt. Second point, in scenarios where we finance by public debt or when we finance by firms, when firms finance these investments, the intergenerational redistributive effects weigh relatively more on the middle age and older generations, while in scenario 3, where both firms and households finance these investments, the young and future cohorts are relatively more detrimentally affected. Third point, the magnitude of the signal price and tax increase for firms and households should be subdued, should be lower, if some governments seeks to limit the negative macroeconomic effect and to improve pro-use redistributive properties. Final points, these results on French data feed into the current debate ignited by Blanchard about the intergenerational limited implication of public debt. As a reminder, Blanchard, in a theoretical overlapping generation setting, suggests the possibility of positive intergenerational effects when we finance by public debt, and we empirically partly confirm these results in the context of a low carbon energy transition financed by debt. Indeed, and this is my last sentence, we find that public debt may be a good way to lessen significantly the overall detrimental implication of a low carbon transition on the activity. So thank you for attending this presentation, and I would be happy to answer any question you may have.
Thank you, Laura. So we have time for discussions and questions. Please, if you have any question, you can raise your hand.
Okay, Stefan, there is Stefan. No?
Yes.
Yeah, thanks indeed for this presentation. Very interesting. I wondered how country-specific your analysis is. So would you assume that your results apply also to other regions, or how much does the empirical data of France play a role in your analysis?
I only focused on France, to be honest, because this is a big exercise to model redistributive effects on 15 cohorts. So we choose to focus only in France, but I would love to extend that question to other European countries, because I think that studying that type of question for Germany, for instance, which is completely different, it can be very interesting, you know. But for my thesis, I only focused on France.
Sure, I totally understand. But my question would rather be, as your results and your conclusions are very general ones, right? That financing by debt.
Very what? Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Your conclusions are very general ones. That I understood that financing by debt will burden some households, or intergenerational aspects will be. There are different results coming out when financing by debt. And would you assume that these conclusions hold also for other regions, or is your analysis too country specific to this conclusion without having the empirical data of these other countries?
The thing is that for this special question of financing private investment, I mean, I read many papers about how to finance different types of investments regarding redistributive effect, intergenerational redistributive effect. But in my special question of low carbon investments in the power sector and the following redistributive effect, I didn't see other papers with 15th generation, etc. So it's difficult for me to say that, to compare my results to other papers, because they studied investments, but in other sectors, or, you know, this is the only answer I can give you.
Okay, yeah, but thanks.
Thank you. Other questions or remark? Well, I have some. My first question is, I was a little, it was very interesting, and at the same time I was a little puzzled by this idea that public debt would be the best solution, in a sense, of course. My question is, how sensitive are your results to the interest rate, to the level of the interest rate? And this is also related to another more general question, which is discounting in the different scenarios. And you know, you have this intergenerational question, so immediately we think about discounting. And could you just tell us a bit more about this? So the sensitivity of your result to the interest rate, and the question of discounting, how you dealt with this in your model. Thank you.
Okay, my model is very sensitive to the interest rate, and to be honest, I'm actually currently making lots of tests. Two type of tests. A type of test regarding if I'm increasing by 1% my interest rate, how my model is sensitive, and another type of test where I put other data from the literature and the interest rate, and I'm testing and watching if my model is very sensitive to this data, and this is the case. The interest rate, my model is very sensitive to the interest rate. So this is for the first question. In the discount rate, regarding the discount rate, my discount rate is around 1%, and I have two I read lots of papers and I have lots of sources, but I have two sources in mind, one from the IMF paper and the other one from Kathleen Schubert, who made lots of paper and on French data, and I took a paper as a reference to put my to choose my discount rate. So it's it's 1% if you want the specific data. Around 1%, 0.98.
Okay.
I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah. I think it would be great to have this sensitivity analysis that you mentioned on the interest rate, also to have these results and to see. And it's also related to Stefan's question, because I guess for the interest rate, the application of different countries will also depend on this sensitivity as well. Maybe not in Europe if we have kind of common debt, but in other areas in the world for sure. And another question is about the fact that actually firms support a large part of the burden, and this can be seen in your scenarios because if they have to find the private investment, there is this kind of bifurcation in comparison to their baseline. These investments are costly, and so compared to a business as usual situation, of course, this is quite costly for them. My question is about this baseline and this business as usual scenario, the basis of your comparison, in a sense. Did you include any costs related to climate change, basically, in the sense that if you look at 50 years ahead, and you say, well, actually the baseline situation is a situation where firms do not have to make low carbon investments, and I want to see what is the cost of those low carbon investment, and I look at the difference between the two. The thing is that actually the baseline scenario, if you look at the costs of climate change, the baseline scenario will not occur like this, in the sense that firms will have to support huge costs due to an overwhelming climate change, 3-4 degrees, etc. And so it would be perhaps more to have a very clear view of the costs of the low carbon investment would require to have a comparison with this baseline scenario corrected by the potential costs of climate change. Is it something you have in mind? Is it something you try to make some calculation with this or not?
This is something I have in mind for future works. But the thing is that when you have such a question, it's important to focus on one special question. But I think the model I developed, I can completely answer this question, and I can make this variant scenario. But for me, my baseline scenario is the only changes over time is weighted to the technical progress and population growth rate. This is the only thing that changes my baseline scenario, but I couldn't make this exercise. I think this is something I want to do for future works, but it's a very interesting question.
Okay, yeah. I don't know if it would change the result from one scenario to the other. Not necessarily, I don't know. But maybe if the costs of the investment on the private sector is more important in one case than the other, maybe you would see a difference, I don't know. Maybe you have any idea about what it would change on your scenarios or your results? Do you have some intuition about this?
The thing is that I didn't model carbon footprint. My exercise is a little bit different. I'm just modeling the investment amounts, and I'm looking at the redistributive effects and macroeconomic effects on 5 economic sectors. So this is another question, but for sure, studying the carbon footprint and the cost of climate change on households can be a very interesting question, but I think it's a little bit different than the one I'm focusing for this thesis.
Okay, thanks. Any further remark or question or Laura's presentation or on Stefan or Tarek's presentation as well before we wrap up all of this? No, everybody's fine. Great. Okay, so maybe we can close this session a bit early, but we had just 3 presentations. So that's normal. We had plenty of time, I think, to